So here we are in part 5 of the series with a lot of loose threads to wrap up. In part 1, we went through Jaime and Brienne's story in A Storm of Swords and stated that it ended pretty damn poorly, or at least in complete contradiction. After establishing in the bath at Harrenhal that oaths can be pretty horrible and sometimes it's perfectly fine to break oaths, Jaime and Brienne at book's end become resolved to fulfill oaths. Then in part 2 and 3, we went through Brienne's story in A Feast for Crows, where she finds that patriarchy, reinforced by religion, pushes the idea of chivalry and emotional toughness, which are damaging to people as they are antithetical to justice, equity, and mercy. Then in part 4, we talked about the Squishers and how the entire patriarchal system is propped up by widespread continuous war. And these themes are highly linked to the Bran story, the underlying conflict of all of Ice and Fire. So admittedly, this all does seem a bit disparate. How does it all come together? How do oaths, the patriarchy's push for chivalry and emotional toughness, war, Bran, the others, and the Squishers all relate to each other? And how can war and all these other problems be solved? Well, I promised you that Lady Stoneheart was the key to all of this, and that it was a shame that she was eliminated from the show. And yes, that's true. Brienne's encounter with Lady Stoneheart is one of the most fundamentally important chapters in all of Ice and Fire, as it's the moment of Brienne's change, the spiritual climax of her journey, and in my opinion, the key to understanding all of Ice and Fire. So why is Brienne's change so damn important? Well, I need to talk about existentialism and our author's beliefs. Now, I'm not 100% certain that our author is an existentialist. We know that he's an atheist, and we know that he's not a nihilist. He believes in something, but it doesn't come from an external code like religion. And his writing, especially Dying of the Light and In the House of the Worm, hit existentialist themes so closely that I would be pretty floored if he hadn't studied the subject. Not to mention, we have this pretty iconic passage from Jaime's story in A Storm of Swords. When he was done, more than 3/4 of his page still remained to be filled. Between the gold lion on the crimson shield on top and the blank white shield at the bottom, Sir Gerald Hightower had begun his history, and Sir Barristan Selmy had continued it. But the rest, Jaime Lannister would need to write for himself. He could write whatever he chose henceforth. Whatever he chose. Now, it's rather important to note that the central tenet of existentialism is existence precedes essence. This means rather than essence of humanity being first imagined by a god and then humanity itself being put into existence by God, humankind existed first without the help of a god and without a predefined essence. Humanity is then left to define itself. For example, if a person chooses to climb a mountain, climbing a mountain becomes part of that person's essence. God didn't make that person climb the mountain. They had the freedom of choice and chose to climb the mountain and make that part of their essence all by themselves. God didn't make them a mountain climber, they made themselves a mountain climber. Even when genetics is introduced, or the culture and circumstances that a person is born into, that is, predetermined aspects of a human, an existentialist would say that those are not part of our essence. Humans still have freedom of choice, and our essence is what we choose to do with our dealt hand. That is, with our given circumstances. A person born without legs still has the freedom of choice and is still defining their essence all by themselves. So say that legless person still climbs the mountain, they are a persevering mountain climber. And so what we have with the Jaime passage is the central existentialist tenet. Jaime exists, and Jaime's essence, represented by the White Book and his ability to do anything he wants with his life, is not defined by anyone else but him. He has the absolute freedom to choose his actions. He has the freedom to define his essence. He has the freedom to define himself. In fact, Jaime thinking about the sum of his life and what defines him with the White Book is what existentialist Martin Heidegger would call being towards death, something that is needed to gain an authentic perspective. And the existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre said that existentialism confronts man with the possibility of choice and that man chooses himself. And we find that choice is a huge part of how the Brienne story in A Feast for Crows ends. Lady Catelyn's fingers dug deep into her throat, and the words came rattling out, choked and broken, a stream as cold as ice. The Northman said, "She says that you must choose. Take the sword and slay the Kingslayer, or be hanged for a betrayer. The sword or the noose," she says. "Choose," she says. "Choose." And so once again with Brienne, we find that existence precedes essence. Lady Stoneheart in the passage is telling Brienne to make a choice that will define who she is. Kill Jaime and establish herself as an Oathkeeper, or refuse and define herself as a betrayer. Brienne is the one in control of her essence, and not any god. Now, our author has a pretty standard pattern for characters. He establishes them one way, and then there's an existential crisis, usually in the form of a fever dream or a long period of isolation where they go nuts thinking internally, and then they make a big, powerful choice that redefines them. Yes, there may be additional conversations before or after the existential crisis, and the big change may have regressions, but the pattern is pretty undeniable. Establishment, crisis, change. For example, Ned is established as a man who is dedicated to honor and truth, but then he spends Eddard 15 in isolation, he goes a bit nuts, and then he changes. He declares Joffrey king to protect Sansa. Or Daenerys is established as a caring, naive girl, and then she spends Daenerys 9, A Game of Thrones, having a fever dream. And then we get a change. The Pyre. For Catelyn, it's Catelyn 7, A Clash of Kings, thinking things over with her sleeping sick father, and then she releases Jaime. We have Davos on the rock, accepting the mother, changing his outlook on the world, Jaime's long dream before going back for Brienne, Cersei's isolation before her confession. Something has to cause our characters to change, so our author inserts an existential crisis to change that character. It's essentially the Faulkner quote that our author loves talking about all the time in interviews, the human heart in conflict with itself. The point is, with Brienne 8, our author has signaled that this is a moment of Brienne's big change. Her pyre, her release of the Kingslayer, her return to the Bear Pit. Brienne has a fever dream existential crisis at the beginning of Brienne 8 that goes on for 5 pages, a little less than half the chapter. And in that dream, nearly every significant event of her life is explored. The dream is essentially her white book page, and she clearly laments how unimpressive it is. It's mostly filled with failure and dead bodies. This all mirrors Jaime's disappointment with his page back in A Storm of Swords. And at both chapters' ends, our characters must then choose how to define themselves, with Brienne's choice being rather explicit, an Oathkeeper or a betrayer, the sword or the noose. However, there is a major difference between Jaime's choice and Brienne's choice, and there is a lot to talk about with that choice between the sword and the noose. So first off, the sword and the noose clearly represent Brienne's oath to Catelyn, or death. Or if you like, death to Jaime or death to Brienne. Of course, this my way or the highway seems like a limitation of choice. It appears that Brienne is being forced into a bad situation. Unlike Jaime, who has infinite choices, Brienne on a surface level seems to be limited. And then on a second level, we know that dicks are swords and swords are dicks, and the sword is a phallic implement of death and war, and the noose is a vagina-like symbol of death and mercilessness, a corruption of the vagina shield. And these represent the bad, not much of a choice that Brienne was given with regards to her gender-associated actions in life. She can choose the subservient life of a traditional woman in accordance with the principles of chivalry, where she's not valued that much because she's ugly and awkward. Or she can live the life of an emotionally tough fighter, riddled with PTSD and shunned because she's not a man. Again, this seems like not much of a choice. And then on a third level, we appear to have a philosophical choice between two sets of beliefs. Either follow an external code, Catelyn, or die. We have all the problems with objective morality, or we have nothing, nihilism. Not much of a choice, it appears. But here's the thing. Existentialists tend to believe that humans have much more freedom than they actually think. And this does seem to be the case with Brienne and those choices. Lady Stoneheart appears to offer an impossible choice. Agree to kill Jaime or die. Except no, there are other choices. The The most obvious is that Brienne can simply lie to Lady Stoneheart and say she's going to kill Jaime and then do something else entirely. Yes, Brienne would be breaking her oath to be Catelyn's sword and she would be lying, but oath-keeping and truth-telling are limitations that Brienne has put upon herself. You see, as I said previously, existentialists believe that humans are very free, condemned to be free, and the limitations they face in life are mostly self-imposed. Oh, people make excuses for the reasons they aren't free, but an existentialist would say that this is often self-deception. Perhaps one claims they want to climb a mountain, but they also claim they can't afford such trip. This is self-deception, as one can put in extra shifts at work, or borrow money, or steal money, or sell possessions, or a lot of things to make that trip happen. And if they choose not to do any of those things, they are choosing not to climb that mountain, meaning they didn't really want to climb that mountain. Which is fine, but an existentialist would say be honest with yourself. Essentially, existentialists believe that humans, when being authentic, recognize that they have freedom. They are in control of their choices, they are in control of their essence. Brienne, in fact, is not limited to just killing Jaime or dying an oathbreaker. She has freedom and a lot of choices. Not to mention, no one gets to define Brienne's essence except Brienne. And the same freedom can be seen with the gender-related choices that Brienne and everyone else in this world are given. People tell Brienne that she can be an emotionally tough fighter or a subservient child rearer. Except, why are those the only choices? Who says that men must be emotionally tough, and who says that women must be subservient child rearers? Why do people think these qualities are the essence of men and women? Randall Tarley would say because the gods made them that way. Essence precedes existence, even though his own son proves that this is not the case. But if we remove divine design for gender categories, what is left? Existence preceding essence, humans defining themselves. Humans can be anything they choose. If a man wants to be a nurturer, he can. If a woman wants to be a warrior, she can. It's their choice. And if enough people choose to do something, the practice shifts to what society associates it with. Computer programming used to be a female-dominated field, and now it's male-dominated. In some countries, sewing is a male-associated profession, while in others it's female. The existentialist Simone de Beauvoir believed that one's gender, distinct from one's sex, was also a choice. A semi-conscious, continuous choice. Now, one may point out that this idea that humans have freedom goes against the idea that humans have agency within certain bounds. Does Brienne really have freedom when she's constricted by social pressures and social norms? I mean, she was almost raped for stepping out of the role of the traditional woman. And while it's true that Brienne does face barriers, one must also recognize that Brienne places many restrictions upon herself. In many ways, Brienne still clings to the patriarchy. She still values traditional female beauty and is hurt when called ugly. She still values the opinions of those who expect traditional gender roles and is hurt when respect is not given to her. She still wants to be treated like a lady. She still values chivalry, virginity, protecting her father's honor, the faith of the Seven, all sorts of barriers that restrict her gender-associated choices. Barriers that she places upon herself. Hyle Hunt even offers her a marriage where she can likely do as she pleases, but she rejects it. And just as there is the freedom to choose how to respond to Stoneheart's threat in a broad sense, and the freedom to choose how to live one's life with regards to gender in a broad sense, there is also great freedom of choice with regards to moral codes. Now, some may argue that morality only comes from external, supposedly objective codes. This is usually in the form of religion, but can also be the doctrine or laws of a ruler or nation, or in the case of Brienne, being Catelyn's sworn sword and doing whatever Catelyn wants. But as I've mentioned, objective codes have problems in that they often contradict, or don't have the nuance necessary to actually deal with everyday situations. They actually require subjective interpretation. Jaime, of course, mentions this very fact to Catelyn in A Clash of Kings with the Jaime dilemma. So many vows. They make you swear and swear. Defend the king. Obey the king. Keep his secrets. Do his bidding. Your life for his. But obey your father. Love your sister. Protect the innocent. Defend the weak. Respect the gods. Obey the laws. It's too much. No matter what you do, you're forsaking one vow or the other. However, some believe that with the rejection of objective religious moral codes, there's nothing left to guide human behavior. They say that a human is only left with hedonism or nihilism. Thoros of Myr even specifically tells Brienne that he laments the Brotherhood without Banner's lack of guidance, not knowing their direction without a king, without an external code. But there are in fact other choices, whether it be Kantian ethics or utilitarianism or humanism or the golden rule or whatever. Humans have the freedom to choose their own code that defines who they are. If existence precedes essence, humans choose their morality. And so what we find is that Lady Stoneheart attempts to make Brienne choose between her vow to her, an external code, or nothing, death, and attempts to define Brienne's morality by this. But Brienne has freedom of choice. In fact, Brienne has such a freedom of choice that she doesn't even interpret the situation in the way Stoneheart attempts to frame it. Let's look again at the final sentences of this chapter. Brienne felt the hemp constricting, digging into her skin, jerking her chin upward. Sir Hyle was cursing them eloquently, but not the boy. Podrick never lifted his eyes, not even when his feet were jerked up off the ground. If this is another dream, it's time for me to awaken. If this is real, it is time for me to die. All she could see was Podrick, the noose around his thin neck, his legs twitching. Her mouth opened. Pod was kicking, choking, dying. Brienne sucked the air in desperately, even as the rope was strangling her. Nothing had ever hurt so much. She screamed a word. So Brienne is facing death, just as the existentialist Heidegger says authentic people do, and in fact she's facing death in the most intense way possible and being asked to choose, the action of defining one's essence. And the choice presented to her is between Jaime's life and her life, oath-keeping or death. And yet, when facing death, when making the choice that defines her essence, Brienne sees only one thing: Podrick. In this moment, Brienne only cares about protecting Podrick. When Brienne makes the choice to Lady Stoneheart, the choice between Jaime dying and her dying, between oath-keeping and death, she chooses protecting Podrick. Brienne rejects external codes and rejects nihilism, and she chooses her own code, caring for others. And this moment actually takes us back to the beginning of Brienne's story, back to the genesis of why Brienne was impressed with Catelyn in the first place. Back in A Clash of Kings, Catelyn chose to protect Brienne simply because Brienne was innocent and needed help. There was no vow or oath or obligation or anything external that drove Catelyn to do this. It was simply her personal desire to nurture and protect. And that aspect of Catelyn impressed Brienne enough that Brienne chose to follow her. And here we find that Brienne is in the same situation with Podrick. She believes him innocent and in need of protection, and so she acts with her personal desire to nurture and protect. In this moment, Brienne is actually more like Catelyn than Lady Stoneheart is. Anyway, at this point in our story, it appears that Brienne will break her vow to Catelyn in order to protect people, just as Jaime broke his vow to Aerys in order to protect people. There is a reason why the Brienne story kept going back to the Bath and Aerys, and why there's an entire chapter on Duskendale. It's because the Jaime story is Brienne's story, and the characters are mirrored. The two started out with external code, but then changed. Whether they realize it or not, the two essentially became existentialists with their own personal moral codes. Now, this is all well and good, but how does it relate to the greater story? Well, this gets into how existentialism as an ideology relates to humanity on the whole. You see, Jean-Paul Sartre argued that when one makes a choice and defines their essence, they're acting to create an image of what they think they ought to be. But since we are all part of humanity, an individual is also defining humanity's essence along with their own. An individual's action is also what they think humanity ought to be. It's a bit like voting in that an action contributes towards defining humanity's essence, but the action is also a statement on what they think other people should act like as well. If one decides to be emotionally tough and shun nurturing, one is acting in a manner to define humanity as a whole as emotionally tough and shunning nurturing. If one decides to act without mercy, one is saying that humanity should be without mercy. If one acts without justice, one is saying that humanity should be unjust. If one decides to limit someone else's freedom, one is saying that humanity should limit freedom. However, if one decides that protecting people is the way to go, One is saying that society ought to protect people. If one decides to nurture, society should nurture. If one forgives, society should forgive. Which brings us to the world of Ice and Fire, a system largely built upon feudalism, sexism, religion, and oaths, which in turn yield a tremendous amount of war, brutality, and suffering. It's objectively a bad system. The essence of humanity in Ice and Fire is simply savage, and many are resigned to the system being this way. But in every respect, people shouldn't be. Unless there's some force using mind control on a massive scale, there is no God making Westeros the way it is. Randall Tarley is wrong. It's the people making it this way, and human beings have freedom to make choices. If they want to redefine their world, they can, just as we have the freedom to redefine our world. But wait, might there be mind control on a massive scale? What about all those prophetic dreams? I mean, Jaime received a dream that made him go back for Brienne at the bear pit. And okay, there may be a bunch of mind control going on. Which brings us back to talking about Bran. But this video's gotten really long and it's gotten away from me a bit, and I just have a lot more to talk about with Bran. So let's break here, and next time we'll talk about how Brienne's choice with Stoneheart relates to Bran and, well, everything. So we will conclude the series in part 6. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.